In the late 1800s, there were nearly 500 bourbon distilleries across Kentucky. By the 1980s, there were fewer than 20. Prohibition killed some, changing tastes killed others. Corporate mergers swallowed entire brands and spat out the names as bottom shelf filler. Some of the best bourbons ever made in America are not rare because they were produced in small batches. They are rare because the distilleries that made them do not exist anymore. The buildings, the stills, the recipes, all of it died with the men who created them. These are 15 American bourbons that have vanished. Quick thing before we start. The data on this channel shows that over 80% of you watching right now are not subscribed. That means you are showing up for the content, but the algorithm has no reason to show you the next video. If you care about bourbon and spirits, hit subscribe. It takes 1 second and it makes sure you do not miss the next one. Number 15. Early Times 354. Early Times is a name most bourbon drinkers associate with cheap whiskey and mixed drinks. In 2011, the distillery tried something different. It released 354, named after its federal distilling permit number. It was a higher quality, properly aged bourbon designed to change the way people thought about the brand. The whiskey itself was genuinely good, smooth and well-rounded, with a sweetness and depth that the standard Early Times never came close to. The problem was that casual drinkers did not understand what they were looking at. There was nothing on the label that told you why this bottle was special. 3 years later, it was gone. It was discontinued due to poor sales. The bourbon community only discovered how good it was after it had already disappeared from shelves. Number 14. Old Crow Bourbon, the original. The Old Crow you see on the bottom shelf today has almost nothing in common with the whiskey that made the name famous. The original Old Crow was created by Dr. James Crow, a Scottish chemist who immigrated to Kentucky in the 1820s and who essentially invented modern bourbon making. He introduced the sour mash process and he used scientific instruments to measure and control fermentation. Before him, bourbon was guesswork. After him, it became a craft. Old Crow became the best-selling bourbon in America for decades, the drink of choice for presidents, generals, and writers. Then, in the 1980s, the brand was bought by Jim Beam. The recipe changed. The age statement dropped. The quality collapsed. What had been America's most respected bourbon became a budget bottle that sits next to the plastic handles. The name survived. The whiskey did not. Number 13. Wild Turkey 12-year-old. Wild Turkey used to bottle a 12-year-old expression that was widely considered one of the best value bourbons in America. It was bottled at 101 proof with a full 12-year age statement, and it had the kind of depth and complexity that put it alongside bottles costing 2 or 3 times as much. Then in 2010, Wild Turkey quietly pulled it from the American market. For a while, you could still find it in Japan, where aged bourbon has a dedicated following, but eventually it disappeared from there too. Wild Turkey still produces Rare Breed and Russell's Reserve, both excellent. But the 12-year-old at 101 proof was a specific thing, and the people who drank it still talk about it the way you talk about a favorite restaurant that closed before you went enough times. Number 12. Old Fitzgerald Bottled in Bond, the Stitzel-Weller Original. Old Fitzgerald is still a brand that exists today, produced by Heaven Hill. But the original Old Fitzgerald Bottled in Bond was a completely different whiskey. It was distilled at Stitzel-Weller, the legendary Louisville distillery founded by Pappy Van Winkle himself on Derby Day in 1935. Old Fitzgerald used a wheated mash bill, meaning wheat replaced rye as the secondary grain, which gave the bourbon a softer, rounder, almost sweet character. That same wheated recipe is why Pappy Van Winkle became the most hyped bourbon in the world. The Stitzel-Weller Distillery closed in 1992. The Old Fitzgerald brand was sold to Heaven Hill, who now produces it at a different distillery with a new recipe. If you find a bottle of Old Fitzgerald with a Stitzel-Weller Distillery stamp on it, you are holding bourbon from one of the most important distilleries in American whiskey history. Number 11. Elijah Craig 12-year-old. This one caught a lot of people off guard. For years, Elijah Craig carried a 12-year age statement on every bottle. It was considered one of the best values in all of bourbon, a properly aged whiskey for around $25. Then, in 2016, Heaven Hill dropped the age statement. The bottle now simply says, small batch. Heaven Hill never officially confirmed why, but the reason was almost certainly supply. The bourbon boom had created so much demand that they could not keep enough 12-year-old stock to fill every bottle. The whiskey in the current small batch is believed to be a mix of barrels ranging from 8 to 12 years old. It is still a solid bourbon, but the guaranteed 12-year-old at that price point was something special. Once the age statement disappeared, the bottles that still had it on the label were cleaned off shelves within weeks. Number 10. Four Roses, single barrel pre-2004. Between 1943 and 2002, Four Roses was not sold as a bourbon in the United States at all. The brand's then owner, Seagram, decided to sell it domestically only as a blended whiskey, a watered-down version of what the brand was actually capable of. The real Four Roses bourbon was exported exclusively to Japan and Europe, where it built an enormous following. When Kirin Brewery bought the brand in 2002, they brought bourbon back to American shelves. The single-barrel expression released in 2004 was a revelation for American drinkers. But here is what vanished. The Four Roses that was exported to Japan throughout the 1970s, the 1980s, and the 1990s was a completely different product than what is available today. Different barrel selections, different aging conditions, different quality standards for a market that demanded perfection. Those bottles are now collector items in Japan, priced at hundreds of dollars for something that once sat on ordinary liquor store shelves in Tokyo. Number 9. Cabin Still. This one might be the most tragic story on the list. Cabin Still was created by William LaRue Weller and bottled at Stitzel-Weller under the direct supervision of Pappy Van Winkle. It was a 100-proof wheated bourbon, the same style that made Pappy a legend. After Stitzel-Weller was sold in 1972 and eventually closed in 1992, the Cabin Still brand was passed from owner to owner. Each one cut corners. The proof dropped. The age dropped. Eventually, someone added the words with natural flavors to the label, which in the bourbon industry means the whiskey has been sweetened or otherwise adjusted. Today, Cabin Still sits on the bottom shelf for around $15. A bourbon created by Pappy Van Winkle, reduced to a flavored whiskey that most enthusiasts refuse to drink. Number 8. Old Grandad 114, the National Distillers version. Old Grandad 114 still exists today, made by Jim Beam, but the original version was produced by National Distillers at their plant in Frankfort, Kentucky. National Distillers was one of the giants of American whiskey, producing Old Grandad, Old Crow, Old Taylor, and Old Overholt rye under one roof. Their version of Old Grandad 114 used a high rye mash bill that gave it a spicy, robust character. When Jim Beam acquired the brand in 1987, production moved to their Clermont facility, and the recipe and the flavor profile shifted. Bourbon collectors refer to the National Distillers era bottles as Dusties, and they hunt for them in the back rooms of old liquor stores. When collectors find one, they are tasting bourbon from a distillery that no longer exists, and from a company that was broken up and sold for parts. Number 7. Green River Bourbon, the original. Before Prohibition, Green River was one of the most famous bourbon brands in America. Their slogan was "the whiskey without a headache," and they marketed it so aggressively that original bar signs and advertising jugs from the early 1900s are still collected as antiques today. The distillery in Owensboro, Kentucky produced bourbon for decades before Prohibition shut it down. The brand lingered in various forms through the 20th century, but eventually disappeared entirely by the early 1960s. The distillery sat empty for decades. In 2020, the site was purchased and reopened as a working distillery, and the Green River brand was revived. But the new whiskey is made with modern equipment, modern techniques, and a modern recipe. The connection to the original is the name and the location. The bourbon itself is something entirely new. Number 6. Yellowstone Bourbon, the Glenmore Original. Yellowstone was once a well-regarded bourbon produced by Glenmore Distilleries in Owensboro. It was named after the national park, and it had a loyal following throughout the mid-20th century. The brand changed hands multiple times, passing from Glenmore to Diageo, and eventually to Limestone Branch Distillery, which is now owned by Luxco and Midwest Grain Products. The current Yellowstone Select is a blend of bourbons from different sources. The original Yellowstone, distilled at Glenmore with its specific water source, its specific yeast strain, and its specific barrels, is a completely different whiskey. Old bottles from the 1960s and the 1970s surface at auction occasionally, and the people who taste them say they are unrecognizable compared to what carries the name today. Number 5. Old Taylor Bourbon. Colonel Edmund Haynes Taylor Jr. was one of the most important figures in bourbon history. He helped write the Bottled in Bond Act of 1897, which created the first legal standards for quality in American whiskey. His distillery on Glens Creek in Woodford County was designed as a showcase for bourbon, with castle-like limestone buildings, manicured gardens, and a railroad stop where visitors could arrive and tour the facilities. It was America's first bourbon tourism destination. Old Taylor Bourbon was made there for decades. Then ownership changed hands and production moved. The original distillery fell into ruin. By the 21st century, the castle-like buildings were crumbling and being stripped for their vintage bricks. In 2014, the property was purchased and restored as Castle and Key Distillery, which now produces its own bourbon on the same site. But Old Taylor Bourbon, the specific whiskey Taylor created, is gone. The brand is currently owned by Sazerac, which bottles a budget version that has nothing to do with the original. Number 4. Old Fitzgerald Prime, Stitzel-Weller's Compromise. When Pappy Van Winkle died in 1965, the bourbon market was already starting to soften. His son Julian Jr. inherited a company under financial pressure. For the first time in Stitzel-Weller's history, they broke from their strict 100-proof standard and released Old Fitzgerald Prime at 86.8 proof. It was meant to be a compromise, a way to stretch supplies and appeal to drinkers who found full-proof bourbon too intense. Instead, it marked the beginning of the end. Within a few years, Stitzel-Weller was sold. Within a couple of decades, the distillery was closed. Old Fitzgerald Prime at that specific proof made at that specific distillery disappeared entirely. Today, some of the last surviving bottles are the closest anyone will ever get to tasting original Stitzel-Weller bourbon. Number 3. Bond and Lillard. Bond and Lillard won the grand prize for Outstanding Bourbon at the World's Fair in St. Louis in 1904. For the first half of the 20th century, it was one of America's premier bourbon brands. Then, Prohibition happened. The brand survived, barely, but lost momentum. It changed hands repeatedly through the mid-century and eventually vanished from shelves entirely. In recent years, Campari revived the name as part of their Whiskey Barons collection, bottled at the Wild Turkey Distillery in Lawrenceburg. But the original Bond and Lillard, the whiskey that won a World's Fair, was made at a distillery that no longer exists using methods that are lost to history. The revival is a tribute. It is not a resurrection. Number 2. The Stitzel-Weller Distillery itself. Every bourbon that came out of Stitzel-Weller deserves a spot on this list. Pappy Van Winkle opened the distillery on Derby Day in 1935 after merging the Weller Distribution Company with the Stitzel Distillery. For nearly 6 decades, Stitzel-Weller produced some of the most respected bourbons in American history. Old Fitzgerald, Weller, Rebel Yell, Cabin Still, and the wheated bourbon recipe that would eventually become the foundation for every bottle of Pappy Van Winkle. The distillery was sold in 1972. It closed in 1992. Today, Diageo uses the site as a tourism attraction for the Bullet brand, and some aging still happens in the old warehouses. But the stills are silent. The recipe is scattered across multiple owners. The wheated bourbon that made Stitzel-Weller legendary is now produced at Buffalo Trace under completely different conditions. You can visit the old buildings, you can stand where Pappy stood, but you cannot taste what he made. Number 1. The 500. In the late 1800s, Kentucky was home to nearly 500 registered distilleries. 500. They were everywhere, small operations run by families along creek beds and large commercial plants along the Ohio River. Every county had at least one distillery. Then Prohibition wiped out most of them overnight in 1920. The ones that survived did so by obtaining federal medicinal licenses, selling bourbon by prescription through pharmacies. Only 6 distilleries in all of Kentucky were granted those licenses, 6 out of 500. When Prohibition ended in 1933, some rebuilt, but the vast majority never came back. Their recipes died with the founders. Their equipment was sold for scrap. Their buildings burned down or were torn apart for lumber. The bourbon you drink today, no matter the brand, comes from a handful of large producers that trace their survival directly back to those 6 medicinal licenses. Everything else is gone. Hundreds of bourbons, hundreds of recipes, hundreds of family traditions stretching back to the 1700s. Vanished overnight because the government decided that the water of life was too dangerous to drink. If any of those 15 took you back to a bottle you once loved and can no longer find, drop a comment. And if you know someone who would appreciate this list, send it to them. Consider subscribing, and we will see you in the next one.